Rebecca and Tom had been living in their dream house for almost 9 years. It was one of those neighborhoods where kids still rode their bikes on the sidewalks and neighbors actually knew each other's names. The houses weren't fancy, but they were well kept, with neat lawns and flower gardens that made the whole street look like something from a magazine. The best part of their property wasn't even the house itself. It was the massive oak tree that stood right on the edge of their yard, its thick branches stretching out like protective arms over both their property and the house next door. This wasn't just any tree. It was the kind of tree that made you stop and stare. The trunk was so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around it. Its roots ran deep into the earth, and its canopy was so thick that even during the hottest summer days, you could find cool shade underneath. Tom loved that tree more than he cared to admit. Every morning he'd drink his coffee on the back porch and watch the squirrels chase each other up and down its branches. Rebecca had hung a swing from one of the lower branches when they first moved in, and their daughter Katie had spent countless hours on it before she went off to college. Even now at 22, Katie would come home for visits and still push herself on that old swing, laughing like she was 7 years old again. The tree had history. Mrs. Henderson from across the street had told them it was planted sometime in the 1800s, long before any of these houses existed. Back then, this whole area was just farmland and scattered homesteads. The oak had watched the neighborhood grow up around it, surviving storms, droughts, and decades of change. It had become a landmark of sorts. People gave directions using it as a reference point. Turn left after the big oak tree, they'd say. You can't miss it. For 8 blissful years, life was perfect. The old couple who lived next door, the Garcias, had been wonderful neighbors. They loved the tree as much as Rebecca and Tom did. Mr. Garcia would often sit in his backyard in the evenings, reading his newspaper in the shade of those sprawling branches. Mrs. Garcia had planted her rose garden right where the tree's canopy ended, knowing the partial shade would help her flowers thrive during the brutal summer months. When the Garcias decided to move to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren, Rebecca and Tom were sad but happy for them. They wondered who would buy the house next door. The real estate agent had mentioned it was a nice young professional woman who worked from home. That sounded perfect. Someone quiet who would appreciate the peaceful neighborhood. Karen showed up on a Tuesday morning in March with a moving truck and an attitude that immediately set everyone on edge. She was the kind of person who seemed to find problems everywhere she looked. Before the movers had even finished unloading her furniture, she was already walking around her new property with a measuring tape and a notebook, writing things down with sharp, aggressive strokes. Rebecca first noticed something was wrong when she saw Karen standing at the property line, staring up at the oak tree with her hands on her hips and a deep frown on her face. She was wearing a perfectly pressed business suit even though it was moving day, and her hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Everything about her screamed, "I'm in charge here." Tom tried to be friendly. He walked over with a plate of Rebecca's homemade cookies, the same welcome gift they'd given to every new neighbor over the years. "Hi there," he said with his usual warm smile. "I'm Tom, and that's my wife Rebecca over there. We live right next door. Welcome to the neighborhood." Karen barely glanced at the cookies. Instead, she pointed up at the tree. "Is this your tree?" Tom looked confused. "Well, it's right on the property line. It's been there longer than any of our houses. The Garcias and we always considered it belonged to both properties. I need to know exactly where my property ends and yours begins," Karen said, completely ignoring his explanation. "And I need to know what you plan to do about all these branches hanging over my yard." Tom felt his smile falter. "Do about them? They're just tree branches. They've been there for over a century. They drop leaves," Karen said, like she was stating an obvious fact that Tom was too stupid to understand. "And acorns. And twigs. All over my property. That's going to be a problem." Rebecca had wandered over by then, curious about their new neighbor. She'd overheard enough of the conversation to feel a little knot forming in her stomach. "The tree has never been a problem before," she said gently. "The Garcias loved it. It provides such beautiful shade and it's home to so many birds and squirrels." Karen's expression grew even colder. "I didn't buy a house to clean up after someone else's tree. These branches are clearly hanging over my property line. That makes them my problem, which makes them your responsibility." Tom and Rebecca exchanged glances. They'd dealt with difficult neighbors before, but something about Karen felt different. She wasn't just complaining. She was making demands like she expected immediate action. Maybe we could talk about this once you're settled in, Rebecca suggested. Moving is stressful, and I'm sure once you've had time to enjoy the neighborhood. I don't need time, Karen interrupted. I need solutions. That tree is going to damage my property values, and it's going to make it impossible to maintain my yard the way I want to. I've already looked into local ordinances about overhanging branches. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Karen turning and walking away without another word, leaving Tom standing there with a plate of cookies that suddenly felt very heavy in his hands. Over the next few days, they watched Karen move in with growing unease. Unlike other new neighbors who took time to settle in gradually, Karen seemed to transform her property overnight. She hired a landscaping crew that worked from dawn until dusk, installing perfectly manicured flower beds, pristine walkways, and a lawn so green and flawless it looked artificial. But what really worried Tom and Rebecca was how Karen kept staring at the oak tree. Every morning when they looked out their kitchen window, there she was, standing in her backyard with her coffee cup, glaring up at the branches like they'd personally insulted her. Mrs. Henderson came over on Friday evening, shaking her head. I tried to welcome her with some fresh tomatoes from my garden, she said. She told me she doesn't eat vegetables that might have been contaminated by environmental debris. When I asked what she meant, she pointed at your tree and said it was dropping organic matter all over the neighborhood. Rebecca felt that knot in her stomach grow tighter. Environmental debris? It's just a tree. That's what I told her, Mrs. Henderson replied. But she went on and on about property rights and legal liability. She's not like the Garcias at all. I don't think this is going to end well. Tom tried to stay optimistic. Maybe she just needs time to adjust. Moving to a new place can make anyone feel anxious. Once she settles in and realizes how peaceful the neighborhood is, she'll come around. But even as he said the words, he didn't really believe them. There was something about the way Karen looked at their beloved oak tree that made him worry about what was coming next. 2 weeks after Karen moved in, the phone calls started. The first one came on a Monday morning while Tom was getting ready for work. Rebecca answered, still in her pajamas and holding her morning coffee. This is Karen from next door, the voice said without any greeting. I need you to know that 3 acorns fell on my driveway last night. I took pictures. This is unacceptable. Rebecca blinked, thinking she must have misheard. I'm sorry, what? Acorns from your tree. On my property. I've documented everything with photos and timestamps. This is the kind of property damage I was talking about. Karen, they're just acorns. It's spring. That's what oak trees do. That's what your oak tree does. On my property. Without my permission. The call ended abruptly, leaving Rebecca staring at the phone in disbelief. Tom came downstairs adjusting his tie, took one look at her face, and asked what was wrong. She called to complain about 3 acorns, Rebecca said, still not quite believing it herself. Tom laughed, thinking she was joking. When he realized she wasn't, his face grew serious. She called to complain about acorns falling from a tree? She said she took pictures. With timestamps, that was just the beginning. Over the next month, Karen called or came to the door at least 3 times a week. She complained about leaves, about bird droppings under the tree, about the sound of squirrels running across her roof after climbing down from the branches. She showed up with printed emails about property law, highlighted copies of city ordinances, and detailed logs of every single thing that fell from the oak tree onto her property. The worst part was how she documented everything. Karen had installed what looked like a security camera system that seemed focused entirely on the tree. She'd take photos of individual leaves that blew into her yard, measure the diameter of twigs that fell during windstorms, and present these evidence packets to Tom and Rebecca with the seriousness of a lawyer building a court case. Look at this, she said one afternoon, standing on their front porch with a manila folder thick with papers. 17 leaves, 4 small twigs, and what appears to be bird-related debris. All from your tree. All on my property. All documented with precise timestamps. Rebecca had reached her breaking point. Karen, it's a tree. Trees drop things. That's nature. Nature doesn't give anyone the right to damage my property values or create maintenance burdens I didn't agree to, Karen replied. I've spoken with my lawyer, and she says I have clear grounds for a nuisance complaint. That's when things got really ugly. Karen started filing formal complaints with everyone she could think of. She called the city's code enforcement department so many times that the officer, Jim Martinez, started coming by just to check on Tom and Rebecca. "I've never seen anything like this," Jim told them during one of his visits. "She's filing noise complaints about falling leaves. I keep trying to explain that trees dropping leaves isn't a code violation. But she insists I'm not doing my job." She complained to the Homeowners Association, demanding they force Tom and Rebecca to control their tree's impact on neighboring properties. The HOA president, Dave Kumar, had known Tom and Rebecca for years and tried to explain that the tree predated all the houses and was actually considered a neighborhood asset. Karen responded by threatening to sue the HOA for failing to enforce property standards. The harassment got more creative and more intense. Karen hired a tree service company to come look at the oak and give her an estimate for trimming it back to the property line. When the arborist explained that such severe trimming would likely kill a tree that old, Karen asked for a removal estimate instead. She then presented this estimate to Tom and Rebecca as evidence that the tree was a liability that needed to be addressed immediately. "According to this professional assessment," she said, waving the papers in Tom's face, "this tree poses significant risks to both properties. The responsible thing would be to remove it before it causes real damage." Tom read through the estimate, his face growing red with anger. "This says you asked them to quote removal of a healthy, mature oak tree. The arborist even wrote a note here saying the tree is in excellent condition and removal would be environmentally unnecessary." "That's just his opinion," Karen replied. "My opinion is that it's a hazard." But Karen's biggest weapon was her ability to make Tom and Rebecca's life miserable on a daily basis. She'd wait by the property line every morning when Tom left for work, ready with a new complaint or demand. She'd interrupt Rebecca's gardening with lengthy lectures about property rights and legal liability. She even started approaching their other neighbors, trying to build support for her campaign against the tree. Most of the neighbors politely declined to get involved. Mrs. Henderson told Karen straight out that the tree was beautiful and she'd hate to see it go. The young family on the other side, the Johnsons, said they loved how the tree attracted birds and wildlife to the area. But Karen kept pushing, insisting that everyone would benefit from its removal. "Think about your property values," she'd tell anyone who would listen. "Think about the liability issues. What happens when a branch falls on someone's car, on someone's house, on someone's child?" The constant pressure was wearing on Tom and Rebecca's marriage. They'd always been a team, but the stress of dealing with Karen was making them short-tempered with each other. Rebecca started avoiding her own backyard because she never knew when Karen would pop up with another complaint. Tom began working longer hours just to avoid coming home to another confrontation. Their daughter Katie came home for a weekend visit and immediately noticed the tension. "What's wrong with you guys?" she asked after witnessing a brief argument between her parents about whether they should just give in to Karen's demands. "It's the new neighbor," Rebecca explained. "She wants us to cut down the oak tree." Katie looked shocked. "The oak tree? My swing is on that tree. You can't cut down my swing tree." "We're not going to," Tom said firmly. "But she's making our lives hell trying to force us to." "She can't actually make you cut it down, can she?" Tom and Rebecca looked at each other. Honestly, they weren't sure anymore. Karen seemed to know an awful lot about property law, and she kept threatening legal action. They'd started wondering if it might be easier to just give her what she wanted rather than fight a battle they weren't sure they could win. The final straw came on a beautiful Saturday morning in May. Rebecca was in the garden, planting new flowers along the fence line, when Karen marched over with her phone in her hand. "I'm calling the police," Karen announced loudly enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "About what?" Rebecca asked, genuinely confused. "Criminal property damage. A squirrel just ran down from your tree across my roof and knocked over a decorative bird bath. This has gone too far." Rebecca stood up slowly, dirt still clinging to her gardening gloves. "You're going to call the police because a squirrel knocked over a bird bath?" "I'm calling the police because your tree is harboring animals that are damaging my property. The squirrels, the birds, all of it. This tree is a nuisance that's affecting my quality of life, and I'm done being patient about it." As Karen dialed, Rebecca realized that this wasn't going to end. Karen wasn't going to get tired and give up. She wasn't going to learn to live with the tree like every other neighbor had for decades. She was going to keep escalating until Tom and Rebecca either gave in or fought back. The question was, how far was she willing to go? The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old books, the kind of place that made Tom feel like he was in over his head before he even sat down. Rebecca gripped his hand as they waited in the reception area, both of them wondering how their peaceful life had led them to this moment. David Chen had been recommended by Tom's brother, who'd used him for his divorce. "He's not cheap, but he's good," his brother had warned. After 3 months of Karen's escalating harassment, cheap wasn't the priority anymore. Sanity was. "So tell me what's been happening," David said once they were seated in his office, legal pad ready. Tom and Rebecca took turns explaining the situation, from Karen's first complaint about acorns to her most recent threat to sue them for willful negligence in maintaining hazardous vegetation. David took notes, occasionally asking questions or raising an eyebrow at some of Karen's more extreme demands. "She's filed 17 different complaints with various city departments," Rebecca said, pulling out a folder they'd started keeping to track everything. "Code enforcement, the health department, animal control, even the fire department." "The fire department?" David asked. "She claimed the tree posed a fire hazard because birds might build nests in it," Tom explained. "The fire chief came out personally to tell her that wasn't how fire codes work." David flipped through the documentation they'd brought. Karen's printed emails, copies of her complaint letters, photos of the evidence she'd collected. His expression grew more serious with each page. "I have to ask," he said finally, "have you considered just removing the tree?" The question hit Tom and Rebecca like a punch to the gut. This was their lawyer, the person who was supposed to help them fight back, and he was suggesting they give up. "That tree has been there for over 100 years, Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "It's been part of our family longer than Karen has even lived in this state." "I understand the emotional attachment," David said gently. "But from a purely legal standpoint, fighting this could cost you more in attorney fees than tree removal would cost up front. Your neighbor seems very determined, and she appears to have done her homework on property law." Tom felt his heart sink. "So she's right? She can actually force us to cut down our tree." "It's complicated," David admitted. "The tree is on the property line, which gives her some rights regarding branches that overhang her land. But more importantly, she's building a case for what's called a private nuisance claim. If she can convince a judge that the tree significantly interferes with her use and enjoyment of her property—" "It's 3 acorns and some leaves," Rebecca interrupted. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but nuisance law isn't about whether the interference is reasonable by normal standards. It's about whether it substantially interferes with her property use, and whether you're aware of the problem but refuse to address it." David explained that Karen's documentation could actually work in her favor. All those photos, timestamps, and complaint letters showed a pattern of ongoing problems that Tom and Rebecca were allegedly ignoring. The fact that she'd hired experts to assess the tree and propose solutions could make her look like the reasonable party trying to find compromise. "What would it cost to fight this?" Tom asked. David was quiet for a moment, doing calculations on his legal pad. "If she actually files suit, we're looking at probably $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees minimum. Maybe more if it goes to trial. And honestly, the outcome isn't certain. She's got a decent case if she presents it right." The drive home was silent. Rebecca stared out the window while Tom gripped the steering wheel, both of them trying to process what they'd learned. Their dream of fighting back and winning was crashing into the reality of legal costs and uncertain outcomes. "Maybe we should get a second opinion," Rebecca said as they pulled into their driveway. Before Tom could answer, Karen appeared at the property line as if she'd been waiting for them. She had another folder in her hands and that same stern expression she wore every time she approached them. "I've been trying to reach you," she said without any greeting. "I had another tree service come look at the situation. They agree that removal is the most practical solution." Tom got out of the car slowly, exhausted by the very sight of her. "Karen, we just got back from our lawyer's office." "Can this wait?" "Actually, no, it can't." Karen opened her folder and pulled out a thick document. "This is a formal notice of intent to file a private nuisance lawsuit. My attorney advised me to give you 30 days to address the tree situation before we proceed with legal action." Rebecca felt like she might throw up. They just spent 2 hours learning about how expensive and uncertain a lawsuit would be, and now Karen was making it real. "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been neighbors for 3 months. Can't we find some other solution?" "I tried to work with you," Karen replied. "I documented every problem, I got professional assessments, I even offered to pay for part of the removal costs. You've refused to cooperate at every step." Tom looked at the legal document in Karen's hands, thinking about what David Chen had told them about legal costs. $15,000 to $20,000 minimum. Money they didn't have for a fight they might not win. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" he asked. "Remove the tree. Completely. I've gotten quotes from 3 different services. The cheapest is $4,200. Tom's mind raced. $4,200 versus $15,000 to $20,000. The math was brutal and obvious. That night, Rebecca cried for the first time since the whole situation started. They sat in their backyard under the branches of the oak tree, watching the sunset filter through its leaves, knowing they might be about to destroy something that had stood there since before their great-grandparents were born. "I keep thinking there has to be another way," Rebecca said. Tom had been thinking the same thing, but every path they explored led to the same conclusion. They could fight and probably lose their savings, or they could give in and hate themselves for it. The next few days were torture. Tom found himself staring at the tree during his morning coffee, memorizing every branch and leaf pattern. Rebecca took dozens of photos as if she could somehow preserve what they were about to lose. They tried one last time to find a compromise. Tom called Karen and offered to pay for professional trimming that would keep all branches on their side of the property line. Karen refused, saying partial measures wouldn't solve the root problem. He offered to install screens or barriers to catch falling debris. Karen said that was still making her property less attractive due to the tree's presence. "I don't understand why you're so attached to one tree," Karen said during that final phone conversation. "You could plant something smaller, more manageable, something that won't create problems for your neighbors." Tom almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Replace a 150-year-old oak with a small decorative tree. It was like asking someone to replace their family dog with a goldfish. But the legal document sitting on their kitchen table made the choice clear. Pay $4,200 now or risk losing everything fighting a battle they probably couldn't win. Tom called the tree service on a Thursday morning. The owner, Mike Santos, sounded surprised to hear from them. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked. "I mean, I'll do the job if that's what you want, but I have to tell you, that's a beautiful tree. It's perfectly healthy. Removing it seems like a waste." "We don't have a choice," Tom said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Your neighbor really won't compromise on trimming? She wants it gone." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Look, I have to ask this, and don't take it the wrong way, but have you checked with the city about permits? Sometimes old trees like that are protected." Tom felt a flicker of hope. "Protected how?" "Heritage trees, environmental designations, that sort of thing." "I always check before removing anything that big. It's just good practice." "We never thought to check," Tom admitted. "Our neighbor seemed so sure about her legal rights." "Well, it probably doesn't matter, but I like to cover all my bases. Tell you what, let me make some calls before we schedule anything. I've seen situations where people got in trouble for removing trees they thought they had every right to cut down." After Tom hung up, he felt the first small seed of doubt about what they were doing. Maybe they should have researched the tree status themselves instead of just assuming Karen knew what she was talking about. But then he looked at that legal document again, with its 30-day deadline and threats of court action, and the seed of doubt withered. They were out of time, out of money, and out of options. The tree was coming down. The oak tree came down on a Tuesday morning in early June. Tom had called in sick to work because he couldn't bear the thought of not being there when it happened. Rebecca had closed all the curtains on that side of the house, but she could still hear every cut of the chainsaw, every crash of falling branches, every shout from the work crew. Mike Santos and his team worked carefully, taking the massive tree down piece by piece. Even though they were destroying something beautiful, they treated it with respect. Mike himself kept shaking his head throughout the process, muttering about what a shame it was to lose such a magnificent specimen. "I still can't believe your neighbor wouldn't accept any compromise," he said during a break. "In 30 years of tree service, I've never seen someone so determined to remove a healthy tree just because it dropped a few leaves." Karen watched the entire process from her backyard, arms crossed, looking satisfied. She'd even taken the day off work to supervise, as if she was afraid Tom and Rebecca might change their minds at the last minute. By 5 o'clock, it was over. Where the majestic oak had stood for more than a century, there was now just a perfectly ground stump and an empty patch of sky that looked wrong somehow. The neighborhood felt different immediately, smaller, less alive. Tom sat on his back porch that evening, staring at the space where his morning coffee companion used to be. The silence felt oppressive. No rustling leaves, no squirrels chattering, no birds singing from the branches. Just quiet. "I feel like we killed something," Rebecca said, joining him with 2 glasses of wine. "We did," Tom replied. "We absolutely did." Karen had come by earlier with a bottle of wine and a thank you card, acting like they'd all been working together toward the same goal. "Doesn't the yard look so much more open now?" she'd said brightly. "You'll see, this was the right decision for everyone." Tom had accepted the wine politely, but the moment Karen left, he'd put the unopened bottle in the trash. 3 days later, everything changed. Rebecca was in the kitchen making lunch when she heard car doors slamming in their driveway. Not just 1 or 2 doors, but several, like a whole group of people had arrived at once. She looked out the window and felt her blood turn cold. 2 black SUVs were parked in their driveway, and 4 people in dark suits were walking toward their front door. They moved with the kind of purposeful authority that made it immediately clear this wasn't a social visit. The doorbell rang before Rebecca could even process what she was seeing. Tom was upstairs in his home office, and she called up to him in a voice that probably sounded more panicked than she intended. "Tom, you need to come down here right now." The man at the front door was tall, serious-looking, and holding a leather wallet with some kind of official badge. "Mrs. Patterson? I'm Agent Rodriguez with the Department of Environmental Protection. We need to speak with you and your husband about a tree that was recently removed from this property." Rebecca felt like the floor was tilting under her feet. "A tree? May we come in?" Tom appeared at the top of the stairs, took one look at the agents at their door, and felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his knees. This was not how people in suits showed up to talk about trees. In their living room, Agent Rodriguez was joined by Agent Chen from the U.S. Forest Service, Dr. Martinez from the Environmental Protection Agency, and someone whose title Rebecca didn't even catch because she was too busy trying not to pass out. "We understand that you recently authorized the removal of a large oak tree from your property," Agent Rodriguez began, consulting a tablet that seemed to contain an alarming amount of information. "Yes," Tom said carefully. "Is there a problem?" The tree in question was a federally protected heritage oak, designated in 1952 as part of the migratory bird conservation corridor that runs through this region, Dr. Martinez explained. "Its removal without federal permits constitutes a violation of the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and several other federal statutes." The words hit Tom and Rebecca like physical blows. Federally protected, heritage oak, violations of federal laws. "We didn't know," Rebecca said, her voice barely audible. "Our neighbor was threatening to sue us. She said we had to remove it." Agent Chen looked up from his notes. "Your neighbor was aware of the tree's protected status. She was sent notification letters by both the city, planning office, and our department. After she initiated inquiries about tree removal in April, she was specifically told that this tree was protected and could not be removed without federal review." Tom felt like he was going to be sick. She knew? Karen knew the tree was protected. Ms. Mitchell received detailed information about the tree's conservation status, the federal permits that would be required for any modifications, and the penalties for unauthorized removal, Agent Rodriguez confirmed. According to our records, she acknowledged receipt of this information in writing. Dr. Martinez was looking at photos on her tablet, probably before and after shots of their property. This particular oak was a critical component of a wildlife corridor that's been under federal protection for over 70 years. It served as a nesting site for 3 different endangered bird species and was a GPS marker point in our conservation database. "GPS marker?" Tom asked. "We use satellite monitoring to track the health and status of critical habitat markers," Dr. Martinez explained. "When this tree disappeared from our satellite imagery 3 days ago, it triggered an immediate investigation." Rebecca started crying. Not just a few tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Tom put his arm around her, but he wasn't in much better shape himself. They'd been tricked. Karen had known all along that removing the tree was illegal, and she'd let them do it anyway. "What happens to us now?" Tom asked. Agent Rodriguez closed his tablet. "The penalties for unauthorized removal of federally protected vegetation can include fines up to $50,000 per violation and up to 2 years in federal prison. However, We'll be conducting a full investigation before determining what charges to file. We're cooperating fully with whatever you need, Tom said quickly. We had no idea the tree was protected. If we'd known... We understand that you may have been misled about the legal status of the tree, Agent Chen said. That will be taken into consideration during our investigation. We'll need you to provide any documentation you have about the removal decision, including communications with your neighbor and the tree service company. Over the next 2 hours, Tom and Rebecca handed over everything. Karen's complaint letters, the legal threat, quotes from tree service companies, even the thank you card she'd given them after the removal. Agent Rodriguez photographed each document carefully. This shows a clear pattern of pressure and misinformation. Your neighbor's acknowledgement that she received federal notification about the tree's protected status while continuing to pressure you for removal could constitute criminal conspiracy. Dr. Martinez was taking measurements of the stump area and collecting samples. We'll need to assess the full ecological impact of the loss. This tree was over 150 years old and served as an anchor point for the local ecosystem. Can we plant a new tree? Rebecca asked desperately. Can we fix this somehow? Heritage trees of this age and ecological significance can't be replaced, Dr. Martinez said gently. But restoration efforts will be part of any resolution to this case. After the agents left, Tom and Rebecca sat in their living room staring at the business cards they'd been given. 3 different federal agencies were now investigating their backyard. She knew, Rebecca said for the 10th time. Karen knew the whole time that we couldn't legally remove that tree and she let us do it anyway. Tom was reading through the information packet Agent Rodriguez had left behind. Federal penalties, environmental impact assessments, potential criminal charges. She didn't just let us do it. She forced us to do it. She threatened us with a lawsuit if we didn't. But why? Why would she want us to break federal law? Tom thought about Karen's behavior over the past few months. The constant complaints, the refusal to accept any compromise, the way she'd celebrated when the tree came down. I think she knew that if she told us the truth about the tree being protected, we'd never agree to remove it. So she lied. Rebecca picked up her phone. I'm calling that lawyer. David Chen. We need help. Federal criminal defense is going to cost a lot more than the $20,000 he quoted us for the civil case. Rebecca looked at him with an expression that was part anger, part determination, and part desperation. I don't care what it costs. Karen tricked us into committing a federal crime. She's not getting away with this. Outside their window, they could see Karen in her backyard, setting up what looked like a new patio set in the space where the oak tree's shade used to fall. She looked happy and relaxed, like someone who had finally gotten exactly what she wanted. She had no idea that federal agents were about to knock on her door, too. Karen's arrest happened on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the federal agents first showed up at Tom and Rebecca's door. Rebecca was watering her surviving plants when she heard the commotion next door. 3 federal agents, 2 local police officers, and what looked like a detective were standing on Karen's front porch while she argued with them in a voice loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. This is harassment, Karen was shouting. I know my rights. I never touched that tree. Ma'am, you're being arrested for conspiracy to destroy federally protected environmental resources, intimidation of witnesses, and filing false statements to federal agencies, one of the agents said calmly. You have the right to remain silent. Rebecca dropped her watering can and ran to get Tom, who was working in his home office. They both watched from their bedroom window as Karen was placed in handcuffs and led to a police car, still protesting her innocence and threatening to sue everyone involved. The investigation that followed revealed just how calculated Karen's actions had been. Federal agents found copies of the protection notices in Karen's home office, along with research she'd done on environmental law and detailed notes about how to pressure neighbors into tree removal without revealing the legal complications. Agent Rodriguez called Tom and Rebecca a few days later to explain what they'd discovered. She knew from the beginning that the tree was federally protected, but she also knew that if she told you that, you'd never agree to remove it. So she created a false legal emergency to force your hand. The evidence was overwhelming. Security cameras from other neighbors had captured Karen intercepting mail from federal agencies before it reached Tom and Rebecca's mailbox. Her computer showed searches for how to force neighbor tree removal and avoiding environmental protection laws. She'd even contacted multiple tree service companies asking them to remove the oak without mentioning its protected status, but the most damaging evidence, Agent Rodriguez continued, is a recording we found on her phone. Apparently, she recorded one of her conversations with you as evidence for her potential lawsuit, but what it actually shows is her deliberately misleading you about the legal consequences of tree removal. Tom felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that they could prove their innocence, anger that Karen had manipulated them so thoroughly. What happens to us now? All charges against you and your wife are being dropped, Agent Rodriguez said. You were clearly victims of fraud and coercion. However, Ms. Mitchell is facing serious federal charges. The legal proceedings moved quickly once federal prosecutors got involved. Karen hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that she was just a concerned neighbor protecting her property rights. But the evidence against her was too strong. The recorded conversation was particularly damning. In it, Karen could be heard saying, "Look, I don't care what some government bureaucrats think about this tree. It's affecting my property values, and I'm going to make sure it comes down one way or another. You can either cooperate or deal with a lawsuit that will cost you everything." What she didn't say in that recording, but what federal agents proved she knew, was that those government bureaucrats were federal environmental protection officers, and the tree she dismissed so casually was irreplaceable habitat for endangered species. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became something of a local sensation. The story of a neighbor who tricked her innocent neighbors into committing federal environmental crimes was too bizarre and infuriating not to attract media attention. Karen's defense fell apart when prosecutors played the recording and showed evidence of her intercepting federal mail. Mrs. Henderson testified about Karen's behavior in the neighborhood, describing how she'd refused to listen to anyone who tried to tell her the tree was special and important. She said old trees were just obstacles to progress, Mrs. Henderson told the court. She said the neighborhood would be better off without all that nature nonsense. Mike Santos, the tree service owner, testified about his attempts to verify the tree's status before removal. "I kept asking if they'd checked for permits, if they were sure about the legal situation. The defendants seemed uncertain, but they said their neighbor had assured them everything was legal. I should have insisted on seeing documentation myself." The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Martinez, who explained the ecological impact of losing the heritage oak. This tree was a cornerstone of the local ecosystem. It was home to 3 endangered bird species, provided critical habitat for migratory routes, and had been monitored by satellite for over 20 years as a key conservation marker. Its loss represents decades of environmental damage that cannot be undone. Karen's defense attorney tried to portray her as a frustrated homeowner who simply wanted to enjoy her property without interference from tree debris. But the evidence of deliberate deception was too strong. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was even more satisfying than Tom and Rebecca had hoped. Federal Judge Patricia Williams clearly took the case seriously, describing Karen's actions as a calculated attack on environmental protection laws and a cruel manipulation of innocent neighbors. Karen was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, suspended to 18 months if she completed her community service requirements. The fine was substantial, $75,000 plus restitution costs that would end up being even higher. But the real consequences went beyond the criminal penalties. The federal government filed a separate civil action requiring Karen to fund the restoration of the damaged ecosystem. This included planting and maintaining 5 new heritage oak trees in approved conservation areas, funding a 10-year monitoring program for local endangered bird species, and paying for the installation of alternative nesting sites to replace what was lost when the original tree was removed. The total cost of the restoration requirements was estimated at over $200,000, spread out over 10 years. Karen's house went up for sale within a month of sentencing as she tried to raise money to cover her legal obligations. Tom and Rebecca, meanwhile, received an unexpected windfall. The federal government's conservation fund provided a grant to help restore their property's ecological balance. They received money to plant native species, install bird-friendly landscaping, and create a small memorial garden where the oak tree had stood. The memorial garden became something special. Instead of trying to replace the irreplaceable oak, they created a space that honored what had been lost while nurturing new growth. Native wildflowers, butterfly-friendly plants, and a small fountain that attracted birds made the corner of their yard into a peaceful retreat. Katie came home for the garden's dedication ceremony, bringing her new boyfriend and their small daughter. 3-year-old Amy was fascinated by the butterflies and asked endless questions about why the big tree had gone away. Sometimes people make bad choices, Rebecca explained, watching her granddaughter chase a monarch butterfly. But when that happens, we try to make something good grow in its place. The neighborhood changed too. Karen's house sold to a young family with twins who loved nature, and immediately asked Tom and Rebecca for advice on bird-friendly landscaping. The new neighbors, Lisa and Mark, were everything Karen hadn't been: considerate, communicative, and excited to be part of a community that valued its natural environment. We actually bought this house partly because of the conservation grant program, Lisa explained during their first neighborhood barbecue. When we saw that this area was part of a federal wildlife corridor, we knew it was somewhere we wanted to raise our kids. Mrs. Henderson, now 87 and still sharp as ever, had become something of a neighborhood celebrity after her testimony went viral online. "I never thought I'd be famous for talking about trees at my age," she told Tom and Rebecca with a laugh. "But I'm glad that awful woman got what was coming to her." The tree service company, Santos Tree Care, started using their experience with the Heritage Oak case as a teaching tool for other property owners. Mike Santos began offering free consultations to help people identify potentially protected trees on their property before any work was done. "I learned my lesson," he told Tom during one of his visits to check on their restoration plantings. "Now I always verify protection status myself, no matter what the property owner tells me." That case changed how our whole industry thinks about due diligence. 2 years after the oak tree came down, Tom and Rebecca received a letter from the Federal Conservation Office. The monitoring program had detected increased bird activity in their restored garden area, and 3 pairs of the endangered species that had nested in the original oak tree had successfully established new nests in the replacement trees planted. "Throughout the conservation corridor, it's not the same," Rebecca said, reading the letter while sitting in their memorial garden. "Nothing could replace what we lost. But at least something good came from something terrible." Tom nodded, watching a family of cardinals feed at the new bird station they'd installed. Karen thought she was getting rid of a nuisance. Instead, she created a whole conservation program that's going to protect trees and wildlife for decades. The final twist came 3 years later, when Karen was released from federal prison and tried to move back into the area. She'd sold her original house to pay her legal costs, but she attempted to rent an apartment in a nearby neighborhood. The rental application was denied when the background check revealed her federal environmental crimes conviction. She eventually moved to another state, but not before local environmental groups used her case as an example in their advocacy work. The Karen Mitchell case became shorthand for what happens when property rights extremism collides with federal environmental law. For Tom and Rebecca, life settled into a new normal that was different from before, but perhaps even better. Their yard had become a destination for bird watchers and nature lovers. Local schools brought children to see the memorial garden and learn about conservation. Their quiet suburban street had become a small but important part of a larger story about protecting the environment and holding people accountable for their actions. On summer evenings, they'd sit in their restored garden and listen to the birds singing in the new trees, knowing that their fight against Karen had accomplished something bigger than just personal justice. They'd helped create a system that would protect other families from similar manipulation and other trees from similar destruction. The oak tree was gone forever, but its legacy had grown into something even more powerful. A reminder that standing up to bullies, even when it seems impossible, sometimes leads to victories nobody could have imagined.